Hello, I'm here with Simon Head, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University and a director of programs at the New York Review Foundation. Simon, thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, you've written a very provocative book. I want to get the title completely right because I think it captures a lot of what you say. Mindless, Why Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans.
Correct.
Now, that's quite in contrast, I think, to what I would call the techno-optimistic view of innovation. So why don't you elaborate on the main thesis?
Well, what I'm really interested in is these extremely complex management systems which are used by large corporations to manage their affairs. And they consist of sub-technologies brought together. Many, many different technologies, rather like happened with the Ford plant a century ago. So you have database systems, you have workflow management systems, you have expert systems, you have management information systems gathering all the information for senior management. And the question which really interests me is, what are the regimes under which these systems operate? Because when you get complex systems like this, lots of different technologies coming together, there can be a great variation in how you use them. You can have a continuum between a very industrial use, where the monitoring and timing aspects of the systems are used really to control employees very rigorously, or you can have them operating under a much more employee-friendly regime, where the autonomy and skill of employees is respected. So the question of how they're actually used and the philosophies and traditions which govern their use is what I'm really interested in.
And historically, it's been felt that these new management systems were there to make workers be smarter, more productive. They were supposed to be productivity-enhancing types of programs. But actually, your book draws the opposite conclusion.
Well, the U.S. economy is an economy worth $4 trillion. It employs, what, 140 million people. So in an economy of that size, you're going to get a lot of variety of regimes with these complex technologies. But what I'm interested in doing is to find what I think is the predominant use. And I think that in working that out, you first of all have to do a lot of research on how the systems are actually used. But I think you have to pay attention to their history. They're not coming out of nowhere. They didn't spring virgin out of the IT earth 10, 20 years ago. They have an ancestry which is very important.
And the ancestry you've mentioned, you say that it's drawn on the experience of the military, and you also say it's drawn on all of the old systems that have been adopted by the airlines themselves. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, I think there are two strands of influence coming down. One is the American tradition of mass production, which really has its origins in the Ford system, and then the extraordinary achievements of American mass production in the Second World War. It won us the war. And then the conversion of this mass production to the civilian economy after the war. So we have a tradition of success in mass production coming down through industrial systems. But what we also have, which you referred to, and this is something I wasn't really aware of until I wrote my book, we have a tradition coming down from the military, that if you look at the management side of these systems, panoptic management systems covering whole corporations, then the real ancestors are the management systems put together to control the US nuclear forces and also to defend the US against attack from bombers, which had to be continent-wide, and they had to translate information from radar systems to digital form very, very quickly.
But presumably, I guess in theory, you'd want your workers, particularly if they're preparing us or defending us from nuclear attack, to be smarter, more productive, actually, and yet the impact seems to have been just the opposite from what you are suggesting in your book.
Yes, I mean, there is no single way in which these systems can be configured. They can be configured in many ways. And you have to look at perhaps some of the Northern European economies to see different philosophies of use, particularly Scandinavia. But my argument is that in the American case, the traditions of centralization in from the military and the systems of control and targeting coming down from the sort of Ford system are extremely powerful. And you see them showing up in the most unexpected places, like in healthcare or even in higher education.
Well, okay, well, let's look at those historical antecedents. After the Second World War, we had arguably the so-called golden age of capitalism in the United States. And so at that point, as you say, many of those military influence management systems were introduced. You had mass production, and yet you had a vibrant automobile industry. You had narrowing inequality, and you had significant growth of the middle class. So what's changed in the last 30 years?
Well, I think one of the things that's changed is the catastrophic decline of unions. If you're looking at what's happened in industrial systems, unions really are in very serious decline. So the ability of unions to have an influence on how the technologies are used is much diminished.
In fact, I think in the United States right now, the rate of unionization is about 9%, and I think it was about over 30% in the 1970s, for example.
Yeah. That's correct. I think another thing that's happened is that the dynamism of these technologies in these corporate control systems is outpacing the ability of the broader civic society to understand what's going on. And that's one of the themes of my research. For example, the dominant corporation in this world is called SAP. It's a German corporation. And it's quite important because it shows that Germany, although it's nowhere in the Steve Jobs world, in this other rather dystopic world, it's very powerful, but hardly anybody's ever heard of it. And so you have this situation where the control technologies are very dynamic, they're not understood, and in a way they're covered in the sort of rather golden aura of high technology and information systems, and indeed of globalization. So I think there's been a slowness in understanding what's going on. And that stands in dramatic contrast to what happened in the first machine age, because at the end of the 19th century, progressive movements in both the United States and Europe had a very good idea what was going on in the dark satanic mills behind the factory walls. And it was the origins of the progressive movement, the social gospelers, the New Deal, the rise of social democratic parties in Europe, of revolutionary parties. But I would say here, the civic society and the sort of classe politique is very much behind in understanding what's going on.
In fact, the thing that struck me when I was reading the book was it really described a 21st century version of this this Marxist dystopia of a man completely alienated from his work and just being a cog in the machinery. And we were, we thought we were getting away from that, and yet we seem to be right back in that situation again.
Well, I don't think we are. I mean, I think you're right, and what I think is particularly important is to see these systems as being expanding. They're expansive systems. So what they're doing over time is to take on more and more complex workplaces. And so I would argue that they played a very important role in the operations of the mortgage machine on Wall Street before the crash in 2007-8. This really was a machine. It's referred to metaphorically as a machine, but it really was. If you look at the way that the financial derivatives passed along a kind of virtual assembly line, it was a machine. And it involved a certain kind of de-skilling. And the other example, which strikes me as somebody who's been at the University of Oxford for the last 10 years, is that these systems are having a profound effect on the nature of scholarship. We have an academic production system for all the UK universities, which obliges us to churn out a certain number of monographs and articles every 5 years, the Soviet planning period. And it's hedged around with all kinds of indicators like indicators of esteem and indicators of impact. If you can get your study featured on the TV, it's terrific. And also how much money you're bringing in research grants. So it has a very distorting effect on great scholarship.
So it's scholarship married to Peter Drucker's management techniques.
Exactly, exactly. But the point is, these systems are expanding into more and more skilled areas. And this should be seen historically.
And of course, as that happens, as you say, the scholarship itself gets distorted. You cite a couple of corporations in the US which are fairly typical of the trends in which you've described in the book. I think Walmart and Amazon are two companies in which you put into this category.
Yeah, I think they're extreme examples, and I'm going to talk about Amazon later on this afternoon. And I go back to this concept of bias, which the mainstream economists talk about a lot. I mean, I think there are two kinds of bias. There is the bias which arises inexorably from the nature of technologies. I mean, go back to the famous case of the pin factory that Adam Smith talks about in The Wealth of Nations. I mean, when they figured out how to make pins on an assembly line, the skills of the artisan in pin making were finished. So you can look at cases of that all along. You can look at how mainframe computers took on the skills of a lot of back office work. But the point I want to make is that there is a second kind of bias, and it arises when you're looking at these complex systems and the particular production regime which governs them. Then bias is a function of management. And the reason why Amazon and Walmart are so significant is that, in my view, they are examples of extreme bias. They are examples of technology systems being used to extract very high productivity from the workforce at the expense of their dignity and well-being. And that's something which we have to be concerned about on ethical grounds, I think.
And Jeff Bezos has now recently acquired the Washington Post. You wonder if that's going to extend into the print media even further than it already has.
Yeah, and I wonder if the Washington Post will do an investigative story on Amazon's workplace methods.
Do you think that is a potential problem that we're likely to see, that, you know, as these people get more involved in the traditional media, that's almost even more Marxist, that once you control the means of production, you then control the way you tell the story, so to speak, actually.
Well, let's see. I mean, I'm concerned about it, certainly.
And what would you say is the way out of this dystopian environment we have today? Well, I mean, do you have policies in mind that you think could be implemented? Keynes seemed to suggest that we just should have more leisure, actually, not worry so much about work. As we became more productive, we'd have a lot more time on our hands. But it's not quite that simple.
No, I don't go along with that. And of course, one of the consequences of this industrialization is that it's actually a force for de-skilling, because you're hedging around people's skills with timing systems, monitoring systems, and expert systems. So they're actually earning less, which it shows up in the statistics. So people have actually got to work as long, if not longer, than they have, just in order to make ends meet. But I think the solution to this has to be political. You're not going to get, certainly in the US and the UK, a revival of the union movement. I just don't see that, and I don't see strong professional associations emerging either. I think that the solution lies in politics. We saw it with the New Deal. The New Deal was a great political movement with strong roots in the working class against the conditions of the time.
And yet, during the New Deal arose from conditions, they were even more extreme than what we have today. But the Great Recession of 2008 has been described as the most destructive economic event since the Great Depression. But interestingly enough, we haven't seemed to have seen anything like that, kind of a progressive New Deal impulse. In fact, if anything, the impulse has been to destroy what's left of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when I say we have to, it has to come politically, it looks rather optimistic at the moment, because the chief political current which has emerged from the Great Recession is the Tea Party. It's a kind of Poujadism of the right, which certainly is not a progressive force, but which is also hostile to kind of big business. I mean, Mitt Romney was seen as a kind of corporate schmoozer and not as a vanguard of the Tea Party. So that is a danger, that the main political current arising from this is actually on the right.
And the same thing is happening in Europe. I mean, if you look at most of the non-mainstream, the anti-Euro nationalist parties, they tend to be products of the right. You're not really seeing it on the left, actually.
Exactly. But if you ask me, you know, what should we as citizens do? My answer is that if we're on the progressive side, we have to organize and try and fight the populist right and achieve change.
And if we can't do it through unionization, how do we do it, given that you don't see much scope for
Well, we do it through political organization and the ballot box. Maybe local political organizing coming together in sort of regional national movements, which in the US, I think, have to be affiliated with the Democratic Party. So the revival of the Democratic Party, which I see as a rather hollow institution, as I do the Labour Party.
The Labour Party in the UK, I think it's very much the same. In fact, arguably, they were both the new Labour, as Tony Blair used to call it, and the Democrats, starting under Clinton, were very much progenitors of this new Washington consensus type thinking. So it became bipartisan in nature.
Yeah, well, the whole new Labour phenomenon is extremely bizarre. I mean, I see it as in part a response to the enormous concentration of wealth and power in the sort of London regional bubble economy, which Labour felt it had to accommodate itself.
The problem is you suggested that what we need to do is aspire towards something of a more social democratic nature, like for example what we have in the Scandinavian countries, and yet even in those countries they have not been immune from the influences of the Washington consensus. That there does seem to be, for example, the Eurozone crisis seems to have been used as a means of attacking what's left of the social welfare net in Europe as well.
I think that if you look at I think you have to make a distinction between the Northern European countries, which essentially is the German-speaking countries, the Netherlands and Scandinavian countries, and the Southern Europeans. I think that the Germans have imposed a very austere, drastic regime on the Southern Europeans. I think in the case of the Northern Europeans, there is a kind of history of achievement, what's known in the European communities acquis, which is still there and which is a bulwark against this kind of thing. It doesn't make them immune, but I think it is a kind of bulwark, and particularly in Scandinavia.
It's not quite as extreme.
No.
To change focus for just a moment, in the broader question of innovation and the economics profession, you have some views about that and the way that the economics profession has handled the whole question of innovation.
Yes, I mean, I think that looking at the sort of mainstream tendencies in this area, and I'm looking at the work of Brynjolfsson and McAfee and Katz and Goldin, Autor and so forth, I don't think they have adequately taken on board this second sense of bias. I think what they're most interested in are these cases of narrow technological determinism. When they talk about SBTC, skill-based technological change, they're talking about a rather narrow form of causation which derives from the nature of the technologies. I don't think they've taken on board this second sense of bias when you have to really bring in business culture and history. And I think that there has to be a kind of rebalancing of the economics profession, which is what I understand INET wants to do. I don't think macro economists are good at dealing with this kind of thing because they see themselves as sort of scientists, and they're much more happy with aggregates, whether it's GDP or inflation.
The same kinds of dry management systems almost, and what we call the models in the economics profession.
Right, the models. Whereas what I'm talking about, it has got to be much more open to multidisciplinary factors. It's got to take much more attention to history. And there are economists who've done that. I mean, Schumpeter is the great example, and Nathan Rosenberg of Stanford.
Another great example, that's
right. He's the leading Schumpeterian of our time, and I think there has to be a rebalancing in the economics profession between this kind of humanist economics, which we've been talking about, and a kind of quasi-scientific economics.
Well, that's certainly going to be a goal of ours at the Institute.
Right.
And Simon, we very much appreciate you coming around to speak about the book and these other areas. It's been a great conversation, and we're really appreciating that you took the time for it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.